The sun had just begun to rise over the sleepy town of Maplewood, casting long, golden rays through the narrow streets and lighting up the dew-kissed grass with an ethereal glow. It was the kind of morning that promised a day filled with simple joys, the laughter of children playing, neighbors exchanging greetings, and the comforting hum of a small community going about its business. But on this particular morning, something extraordinary was about to unfold, something that would ripple through the town and leave an indelible mark. Max, an aging golden retriever, trotted alongside his owner, Mrs. Harriet. His once vibrant fur was now peppered with white, and his gait had slowed over the years, but his spirit remained indomitable. The townspeople often remarked on how Max still carried himself with the pride of a dog half his age. Mrs. Harriet adored him, and their morning walks had become a cherished ritual, a gentle way to start the day. "Come on, Max," Mrs. Harriet cooed, her voice warm and motherly. She adjusted her scarf against the crisp morning air as Max sniffed the base of a lamppost. "We don't have all day." Max lifted his head, his ears twitching as if picking up a sound Mrs. Harriet couldn't hear. The old dog's eyes narrowed, and a shiver ran down his spine. Something felt different, off, even. Mrs. Harriet noticed the sudden change in her companion. "What is it, boy?" she asked, concern creasing her brow. Before she could react, Max's ears perked up, and with a burst of energy she hadn't seen in years, he tugged hard on the leash, nearly yanking it from her grasp. "Max," she called out, stumbling to keep up. Her heart thumped with the kind of alarm only a pet owner knows, the fear that their beloved friend might be hurt or in danger. But Max wasn't running away, he was running towards something, driven by an instinct more primal than Mrs. Harriet could comprehend. That he led her into the alley behind the old grocery store, a place they rarely ventured. The alley was narrow and lined with rusting dumpsters, their lids ajar and spilling refuse onto the cracked asphalt. The air was thick with the smell of rotting vegetables, damp cardboard, and a hint of something metallic. Mrs. Harriet wrinkled her nose, her grip tightening on the leash. "Max, what on earth has gotten into you?" she demanded, but the dog wasn't listening. He was transfixed, his nose to the ground, following a scent that seemed to pull him deeper into the shadows. Then, he stopped, his body stiffening like a coiled spring, and let out a low, mournful whine. Mrs. Harriet approached cautiously, her hand trembling slightly. And then she heard it, a sound so faint that she thought she might be imagining it. It was a cry, thin and desperate, echoing off the brick walls. Her breath caught in her throat. Was that a baby? Max moved closer to a pile of cardboard boxes, his eyes wide and anxious. Mrs. Harriet's heart pounded as she crouched down, her hands shaking as she pulled aside the topmost box. There, nestled in a makeshift cocoon of rags and surrounded by the detritus of human neglect, was a baby. The infant's tiny face was flushed from crying, its fists clenching and unclenching in an effort to ward off the cold. The baby couldn't have been more than a few days old. For a moment, Mrs. Harriet was paralyzed. How could something so vulnerable, so fragile, be left in a place like this? Her mind struggled to process the scene, the horror and disbelief crashing over her in waves. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she pushed them back. There was no time for shock. Max lay down beside the baby, his body instinctively curling to offer warmth. His eyes, usually full of playful mischief, now held a solemnity that Mrs. Harriet had never seen. It was as if he understood the gravity of the situation, as if he knew that this tiny life depended on him. "Oh, dear God," Mrs. Harriet whispered, fumbling for her phone. Her hands were trembling so badly that she almost dropped it. "Stay with me, little one," she murmured, her voice cracking. "Stay with me." Max's presence seemed to calm the infant, whose cries softened into hiccups. The sight of the old dog, a protector in the most unexpected of forms, moved Mrs. Harriet deeply. As she dialed emergency services, she couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this unlikely intersection of lives, was the start of something far greater than any of them could understand. The call went through, and Mrs. Harriet's voice wavered as she explained the situation. Help was on the way, but the minutes that followed felt like an eternity. A small crowd began to gather, drawn by Mrs. Harriet's frantic call and the sight of Max lying beside the baby. Neighbors whispered in hushed tones, their faces a mixture of shock and concern. Phones were raised to capture the scene, and the story began to spread, even before it had truly begun, but in the chaos, Max remained steadfast, his body a warm shield, his gaze unwavering. Mrs. Harriet stroked his fur, her heart swelling with gratitude and awe. In that moment, she realized that heroes come in all forms, and sometimes, they're the ones you least expect. Little did they know, this discovery was only the beginning. The events that would follow would challenge everything they thought they knew about courage, fate, and the bonds that connect us all. The world was about to learn just how powerful an old golden retriever's heart could be. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air, and the world seemed to pause in respect for the fragile life cradled by discarded rags. The sun, now climbing higher in the sky, painted golden streaks across the crumbling brick walls, but its warmth couldn't chase away the bone-chilling cold of the alley. The infant's cries had quieted, but a soft, hiccuping whimper still escaped the tiny mouth, as if the baby knew just how close it had come to being forgotten by the world. Max, the old golden retriever, lay still beside the infant, his warmth seeping into the child. His large, gentle eyes watched every twitch and shudder, as if he could will the baby to survive with sheer force of love and determination. Mrs. Harriet, phone still pressed to her ear, could hardly keep her voice steady as she relayed the situation to the dispatcher. Her mind raced with 1,000 questions, each more disturbing than the last. Who could abandon a baby like this? How long had the infant been there? And most importantly, would the baby be okay? The dispatcher assured her that emergency services were en route, but even those words couldn't calm the storm of emotions swirling inside her. She knelt down beside Max, her knees pressing into the damp, litter-strewn ground, and gently touched the infant's cheek. The baby's skin was icy, and the realization made her breath hitch. But there was still life, still hope, and that hope now rested in the paws of a loyal, aging dog. "Stay with me, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice cracking with the weight of her fear and hope. Max's ears twitched at her words, and he let out a soft whine, as if to echo her plea. Around them, the small crowd that had gathered murmured in disbelief. A mother clutched her own child tightly, tears glistening in her eyes. An old man removed his hat and held it over his heart. The sight of Max, acting as the baby's protector, struck a chord deep within everyone who witnessed it. Suddenly, a young man from the crowd stepped forward. He had a shock of red hair and a denim jacket that was frayed at the edges, and his eyes were wide with both worry and awe. "Do you need help?" he asked, his voice uncertain but filled with genuine concern. Mrs. Harriet looked up at him, her tear-streaked face softening with gratitude. "Please," she said, gesturing to her purse lying open on the ground beside her. "Hand me the blanket inside." The young man didn't hesitate. He knelt down, rummaging through the purse until he found a small, knitted blanket. It was worn and a little faded, but it would have to do. With trembling hands, Mrs. Harriet wrapped the blanket around the infant, praying that it would provide some comfort. Max, ever vigilant, nudged the baby gently with his nose, as if to reassure himself that the child was still there, still fighting. His golden fur pressed against the infant, forming a barrier between the baby and the harsh world that had abandoned it. The bond between the old dog and the baby was undeniable, a silent connection that transcended species and circumstance. As the sound of distant sirens echoed through the alley, the tension began to ease, replaced by a cautious sense of hope. The crowd parted, and two paramedics hurried forward, their expressions a mix of professionalism and disbelief. One of them, a woman with dark hair pulled into a tight bun, knelt beside Mrs. Harriet. "We'll take it from here," she said gently, her eyes lingering on Max with an expression of wonder. Mrs. Harriet nodded, her relief palpable. But when the paramedics gently lifted the baby from the ground, Max whined and tried to follow. His leash was still held tight in Mrs. Harriet's hand, but the old dog strained against it, unwilling to let the baby out of his sight. The paramedic paused, glancing back at the dog. "He's quite the hero, isn't he?" she murmured, a small smile breaking through her professional demeanor. Mrs. Harriet's heart swelled with pride. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "He truly is." The paramedics worked swiftly, placing the baby on a stretcher and checking vital signs. The infant, though still weak, seemed to respond to the warmth and care being offered. The red-haired young man, who had helped Mrs. Harriet, lingered nearby, his eyes fixed on the scene. He seemed unable to look away, as if he too had been caught up in the magic of this moment. As the baby was loaded into the ambulance, Mrs. Harriet felt Max's body press closer to her leg. She looked down at him, his eyes wide with worry and longing. She knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his head. "You did good, Max," she whispered. "You did more than anyone could have asked." But deep down, a question lingered in her mind, one that the entire town would soon be asking: who had left this baby here, and why? And as the ambulance doors closed and the sirens wailed once more, Mrs. Harriet couldn't shake the feeling that this story was far from over. The crowd slowly dispersed, people whispering to one another about the miracle they had just witnessed. Yet, even as the alley returned to its quiet, forgotten state, a sense of something greater lingered. It was a feeling of unity, of hope sparked by an old dog and the baby he had found, and in the days to come, this feeling would only grow stronger as the mystery unfolded, pulling Maplewood into a story that no one would ever forget. The alley, which only moments ago had been a forgotten corner of Maplewood, was now the epicenter of a whirlwind of emotion and disbelief. The crowd that had gathered spilled out into the street, growing in number as word of the discovery spread like wildfire. Neighbors who had lived side by side for years but rarely exchanged more than polite nods found themselves drawn together, united by a shared sense of awe and dread. Mrs. Harriet stood beside Max, her knees still weak from the shock. Her hands trembled as she clasped them together, trying to steady herself. The baby had been whisked away in the ambulance, but the image of that tiny, shivering form wrapped in a makeshift blanket was seared into her mind. She glanced down at Max, who remained vigilant, his body tense and his eyes searching for the infant he had so fiercely protected. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "A baby, just left there," one woman murmured, clutching her own child as if to reassure herself that such horror could never touch her family. An older man shook his head, his face lined with worry. "What's the world coming to?" he muttered, his voice thick with disbelief. Sheriff Donovan arrived, his patrol car pulling up with a squeal of brakes that pierced the morning air. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a salt-and-pepper mustache, he exuded authority and calm, but even he couldn't hide the shock that flickered across his face as he took in the scene. He approached Mrs. Harriet, his hat in hand, and offered a small nod of recognition. "Mrs. Harriet," he said, his voice low and steady, "can you tell me what happened here?" Mrs. Harriet recounted the events, her voice quavering as she described Max's determination, the sound of the infant's cry, and the heart-stopping moment when she found the baby lying there, abandoned. The sheriff listened intently, his expression growing graver with each word. When she finished, he glanced at Max, who still hadn't moved from his spot, as if guarding the memory of the baby he had saved. "This dog," Sheriff Donovan said, his voice thick with admiration, "may have saved that child's life." The crowd murmured in agreement, some nodding, others wiping tears from their eyes. Max had become an instant hero, a symbol of hope and bravery in the face of something so cruel. People approached Mrs. Harriet, offering words of comfort and wonder, but she could barely hear them over the pounding of her own heart. A local news crew arrived, cameras and microphones at the ready. A young journalist with a notepad clutched in her hand made her way through the crowd, her eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and solemnity. "Ma'am," she said, addressing Mrs. Harriet, "would you be willing to share what happened here for our report?" Mrs. Harriet hesitated. The attention was overwhelming, and she felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. But before she could answer, Max stepped forward, his tail wagging slightly, as if to say he was ready to face whatever came next. The journalist's eyes softened, and she knelt down to his level. "This is the hero?" she asked, and Mrs. Harriet managed a small smile. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "This is Max. And he saved that baby." The journalist's camera operator zoomed in on Max, capturing the old dog's gentle eyes and noble bearing. The story was already writing itself, a loyal pet turned guardian angel, a baby rescued from the brink of disaster. As the camera rolled, the community watched, each person touched in some way by the events unfolding before them. Sheriff Donovan cleared his throat, bringing the crowd's attention back to him. "We'll need to conduct a full investigation," he announced, his tone serious. "If anyone saw anything unusual in the last few hours, or if you have any information about who might have left the baby, please come forward." His words hung heavily in the air, a stark reminder that behind the miracle of Max's heroism lay a darker, unanswered question: who could abandon a baby in such a cruel manner? And what desperation or darkness drove them to do it? As the crowd slowly began to disperse, Mrs. Harriet felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see the young man with the red hair who had helped her earlier. His face was pale, and his eyes were filled with a mixture of awe and lingering concern. "Do you think?" he began, then hesitated, as if afraid to speak the thought aloud. "Do you think the baby will be okay?" Mrs. Harriet took a shaky breath. "I hope so," she said, her voice heavy with the weight of uncertainty. "I really do." Max nuzzled against her leg, as if to offer comfort. In that moment, Mrs. Harriet realized just how deeply the old dog had affected everyone who had witnessed his bravery. Max wasn't just her pet anymore, he had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, light could be found in the most unexpected places. But the story was far from over. Somewhere out there, answers lay waiting, and the town of Maplewood would soon be drawn even deeper into a mystery that would change them all forever. The town of Maplewood, once a quiet and predictable place, had become a hotbed of speculation and concern. News of the baby rescued by an old golden retriever had spread beyond the town's borders, drawing attention from nearby cities and even national media outlets. Television crews set up camp in the town square, and journalists knocked on doors, seeking first-hand accounts of the miraculous event. The story of Max, the unlikely hero, had captured the hearts of thousands, but for Mrs. Harriet and Max, life hadn't returned to normal. The days that followed were filled with interviews and curious onlookers, each person wanting to catch a glimpse of the dog who had saved a life. Mrs. Harriet tried to keep her composure, but the constant attention wore on her. It was exhausting, and deep down, a sense of unease gnawed at her. Max seemed to feel it, too. He remained restless, his ears perked up at every unusual sound, his gaze always drifting to the alley where the baby had been found. Mrs. Harriet often found him lying by the front door, as if waiting for something, or someone. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story, something just beyond their reach. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of crimson and gold, Mrs. Harriet sat on her porch with Max by her side. Her hands worked absent-mindedly at her knitting, but her mind was far away, lost in the whirlwind of recent events. The baby was safe now, recovering in the hospital, but the mystery of who had abandoned the child remained unsolved. It was a question that haunted the entire town. A car pulled up to the curb, and out stepped Sheriff Donovan, his face lined with the exhaustion of a man carrying too many burdens. He approached the porch, tipping his hat in greeting. "Mrs. Harriet," he said, his voice heavy, "mind if I sit a spell?" "Of course, Sheriff," she replied, gesturing to the empty rocking chair beside her. Max lifted his head, his eyes meeting the sheriff's with a solemn intelligence. The sheriff lowered himself into the chair with a weary sigh. "I've been following up on every lead, every whisper," he said, rubbing a hand over his tired face. "But there's still no trace of who left that baby in the alley. It's like trying to catch shadows." Mrs. Harriet's heart ached. "Who could do such a thing?" she whispered, her voice filled with pain. "How desperate or lost must someone be to abandon their own child?" Sheriff Donovan was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the fading light of the sky. "Desperation drives people to dark places," he finally said. "But it doesn't excuse it. We're doing everything we can to find answers." Max let out a soft whine, as if echoing the sheriff's weariness. Mrs. Harriet reached down to scratch behind his ears, her fingers trembling slightly. Max hasn't been the same, she admitted. He's still watching, still waiting. It's like he knows there's more to come. The sheriff nodded thoughtfully. Animals have instincts we can't always understand, he said. Maybe he senses something we can't see yet. Just then, a rustling sound came from the bushes at the edge of the yard. Both Mrs. Harriet and the sheriff turned their heads, and Max was on his feet in an instant, his body tense, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The sound of footsteps followed, hesitant and light, as if the person they belonged to wasn't sure they wanted to be found. Sheriff Donovan stood, his hand moving instinctively to the firearm at his side. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steady and commanding. A figure emerged from the shadows, and the sight made Mrs. Harriet's breath catch in her throat. It was a young woman, barely more than a girl, with wide, frightened eyes and clothes that hung loosely on her thin frame. Her hair was tangled, her face pale and smudged with dirt. She raised her hands in a gesture of surrender, her lips trembling as she tried to speak. I'm not here to hurt anyone," she stammered, her voice cracking. "Please. I just need to know if the baby is okay." The air around them seemed to thicken, and Mrs. Harriet felt her heart stop for a moment. Sheriff Donovan's eyes narrowed, and his grip on his weapon relaxed slightly. "Who are you?" he asked, his tone still firm but tinged with a note of compassion. Tears spilled down the young woman's cheeks, and she clutched at her chest, as if her heart might break from the weight of her own fear and guilt. "I'm the mother," she whispered, her voice so faint it was almost swallowed by the evening breeze. "I didn't know what else to do. Please, is my baby safe?" Mrs. Harriet felt a wave of emotions crash over her, anger, sadness, confusion, but most of all, an aching sense of compassion. The girl standing before them was not a monster, she was broken, lost, and desperate. Max, who had been growling moments before, softened his stance. He approached the young woman slowly, his eyes gentle, as if he too understood her pain. The girl sank to her knees, her sobs racking her thin frame. Max pressed his nose against her hand, offering comfort in the only way he knew how. Mrs. Harriet's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out, her voice trembling. "The baby is safe," she said, her heart aching with the weight of the moment. "Your baby is safe." Sheriff Donovan stepped forward, his expression a mix of duty and empathy. "We need to talk," he said gently, helping the girl to her feet. "There's a lot we need to understand. But for now, you need to know that your child is being cared for." As the girl was led away, her story still untold, the sun finally disappeared beyond the horizon, leaving behind a sky scattered with stars. Max sat beside Mrs. Harriet, his head resting on her lap, as if to reassure her that, even in the darkest times, there was still hope to be found. But the mystery was far from over, and the revelations yet to come would test the strength of an entire community. Down from the inky black sky, but their light did little to break the heavy darkness that hung over Maplewood. The young woman, whose name was revealed to be Emily, had been taken to the sheriff's office. Yet, even as she was led away, her haunted eyes lingered in Mrs. Harriet's mind, leaving an ache she couldn't shake. Max sat quietly by Mrs. Harriet's feet, his head resting on his paws. The golden retriever had sensed the girl's pain, her fear, and perhaps even the desperate love that had driven her to such a dark choice. Mrs. Harriet, unable to find peace, stood up from her porch chair and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. "Sleep would not come easy tonight. Come on, Max," she whispered. "Let's take a walk." The two of them wandered down the empty streets of their beloved town, the familiar roads now shadowed by the mystery that had wrapped itself around Maplewood like a shroud. Storefronts were dark, and wind chimes whispered in the breeze, echoing the unspoken questions hanging in the air. Who was Emily? What had driven her to abandon her child in the alley? And most disturbingly, was this truly the end of the story, or just the beginning of something much larger? Max seemed restless, his tail swishing side to side in a slow, uncertain rhythm. His ears twitched at every sound, and his paws moved faster, leading Mrs. Harriet toward the hospital where the baby was recovering. When they arrived, the building stood quiet and imposing, its fluorescent lights casting a pale glow onto the parking lot. Mrs. Harriet hesitated at the entrance, unsure of what had drawn her there. Perhaps it was maternal instinct, or perhaps it was the inexplicable feeling that she needed to be close to the baby she had helped save. Inside, the sterile smell of antiseptic filled the air. Nurses moved through the halls, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Mrs. Harriet made her way to the neonatal ward, where she was met by a nurse she had spoken to before. The woman recognized her and offered a warm, albeit tired, smile. "Mrs. Harriet," the nurse said softly, "you're here late." Mrs. Harriet nodded, her hand resting on Max's head. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted. "I just needed to know that the baby was all right." The nurse's eyes softened. "The baby is a fighter," she said. "Holding on stronger than we expected. But it'll be a long road." She paused, her gaze flickering to Max. "Your dog, he's something special. It's almost like he knew exactly what that little one needed." Mrs. Harriet smiled, a hint of pride warming her heart. "Max has always had a sense about things," she said. "But even he's been more restless than usual." The nurse frowned slightly. "Restless how?" Mrs. Harriet opened her mouth to explain, but before she could, a commotion erupted at the far end of the hallway. Voices rose in alarm, and a crash echoed through the sterile corridors. Nurses and doctors sprang into action, rushing toward the source of the chaos. Mrs. Harriet's heart leapt into her throat, and Max stood up, his body tense. "What on earth?" she began, but her words were drowned out by the clamor. A doctor rushed past them, and Mrs. Harriet overheard snippets of frantic conversation. "The baby," someone cried. "We're losing the baby." Time seemed to slow. Mrs. Harriet's vision blurred with panic, and she found herself moving, her feet carrying her down the hall before she even realized what she was doing. Max followed closely, his nails clicking on the linoleum floor. The neonatal ward was a hive of activity, doctors and nurses working desperately around the tiny, fragile life that had already endured so much. Tears stung Mrs. Harriet's eyes as she stood back, her hands pressed to her mouth. The baby, who had seemed so strong only moments before, was now fighting an invisible battle. Monitors beeped wildly, and medical staff called out instructions over the cacophony. Mrs. Harriet's knees weakened, but she held herself up, whispering prayers she hadn't spoken in years. Max, however, did not hesitate. He moved forward, weaving through the chaos with a purpose that only he understood. One of the nurses, startled, tried to shoo him away, but Mrs. Harriet intervened. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. He has to be here." The nurse hesitated, her eyes wide with uncertainty, but something in Mrs. Harriet's voice, or perhaps in the determined, almost sacred look in Max's eyes, made her step aside. Max approached the baby's incubator, pressing his nose gently against the glass. His body seemed to radiate warmth and calm, a presence that filled the room with something almost tangible. Hope. The baby's frantic cries softened, the beeping monitors began to steady, and the tension in the room eased as if an unseen hand had gently smoothed it away. Doctors exchanged astonished glances, and the head nurse whispered, "It's a miracle." Mrs. Harriet's legs gave out, and she sank into a chair, tears streaming down her face. Max stayed by the baby, his golden fur glinting under the harsh hospital lights, a guardian angel in canine form. The battle was far from over, but for that moment, they had won. But as relief washed over Mrs. Harriet, she knew deep down that this miracle came with a price. The mystery of Emily, the baby's mother, and the darkness that had driven her to desperation still loomed. And as much as she wanted to believe that everything would be okay, a whisper of fear lingered, reminding her that the hardest part was yet to come. The morning air was heavy with anticipation, and the town of Maplewood seemed to hold its breath. Rumors of the young mother who had appeared from the shadows the night before had spread, adding another layer to the mystery that had gripped the small community. At the center of it all, Mrs. Harriet found herself once again at the hospital, Max loyally by her side, their presence a testament to the extraordinary events that had unfolded. Emily sat across from Mrs. Harriet in the hospital waiting room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The young woman looked exhausted, her eyes rimmed with shadows, but there was a spark of hope in her gaze. Sheriff Donovan stood nearby, his face unreadable as he watched over the fragile reunion. The baby, still recovering, lay in the neonatal ward, his small, steady breaths a symbol of resilience. Emily's voice trembled as she spoke, her words barely more than a whisper. "I never wanted to leave him," she said, her tears falling silently. "But I was so scared, so lost. I thought, maybe he'd have a chance if someone found him. Someone who could care for him better than I ever could." Mrs. Harriet's heart ached at the raw pain in Emily's voice. The story was beginning to take shape, a tragic tale of desperation and love intertwined. Emily had been running, from an abusive partner, from a life that had left her broken. The baby, her only light in the darkness, had been abandoned not out of cruelty, but out of a desperate hope for a better future. Sheriff Donovan cleared his throat, his voice gentle. "We need to make sure that both of you are safe now," he said. "You've been through enough, and no one should have to face that kind of fear alone." Emily nodded, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Mrs. Harriet reached across the space between them, her old, weathered hand finding Emily's trembling one. The connection was immediate, a silent understanding passing between them. "You're not alone anymore," Mrs. Harriet whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "We'll figure this out together." Max, sensing the moment, moved closer to Emily, his warm eyes full of understanding. The golden retriever gently nuzzled her hand, and Emily let out a small, broken laugh, her fingers threading through his soft fur. It was a moment of healing, fragile and beautiful, like the first light breaking over a dark horizon. Just then, a nurse appeared, her face breaking into a relieved smile. "The baby is doing much better," she announced. "He's strong, a Real fighter." The tension that had gripped the room melted away, replaced by a flood of relief. Emily's sobs turned into laughter, the sound rich with both joy and disbelief. Mrs. Harriet felt her own tears spill over, a deep, grateful smile spreading across her face. Max let out a happy bark, his tail wagging furiously, as if he too understood the miracle they were witnessing. But even as the joy of the moment filled the room, a sense of closure settled over them all. The baby had survived, and Emily had found a way back to her child, but the journey wasn't over. There were still challenges ahead, wounds to heal, and a future to rebuild. Yet, they had something now that they hadn't before: hope, and a community that stood ready to support them. Sheriff Donovan stepped forward, his voice kind but firm. "Emily," he said, "we'll help you find a safe place, and we'll make sure you both have what you need. This town takes care of its own." Emily looked up, her tear-streaked face glowing with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice full of sincerity. "I don't know how to repay you all, especially you, Mrs. Harriet. And Max." She leaned down, pressing a kiss to the top of Max's head. "You saved us both." Mrs. Harriet chuckled softly, wiping at her eyes. "Oh, don't worry about that," she said. "Just promise to pay it forward one day. That's all the thanks we need." Outside, the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow over Maplewood. The town that had been shaken by darkness now stood united, strengthened by the love and courage of an old dog, a determined woman, and a young mother finding her way. Max barked once more, his tail wagging as he looked out at the world he had helped change, one life at a time. And in that moment, they all knew, some stories don't just end, they echo, leaving ripples that spread far and wide, reminding us that even in our darkest hours, hope can come in the most unexpected forms. I hope this emotional story touched your heart as much as it did ours. Max's heroism and Emily's hope remind us that even in the darkest times, love and courage can light the way. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to TOGOHQ, give our video a thumbs up, and share your thoughts in the comments. We can't wait to connect with you again through more incredible stories. Remember, every hero has a story, and sometimes, heroes come from the most unexpected places.